Realizing the gravity of her mistake, Karen bolted upright in her seat, her face pale. She glanced nervously toward the cockpit, where the pilot was still stationed, likely oblivious to the bombshell revelation. Gathering her composure, or at least attempting to, she stood up and walked unsteadily toward Admiral Thompson, her heels clicking awkwardly against the floor. When she reached his row, she stopped abruptly, hovering uncertainly as though unsure whether to sit or stand. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, she stammered, Sir, I didn't realize." Admiral Thompson looked up at her, his expression unreadable. There was no anger in his gaze, no triumph or vindictiveness, only a quiet authority that demanded accountability. "Realize what, ma'am?" he asked calmly, his tone cutting through the tension like a knife. Karen swallowed hard, her cheeks flushing red. I didn't know who you were. If I had known." Her voice trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished. What could she say? That she wouldn't have acted so rudely if she'd recognized his rank. That her prejudice would have evaporated instantly if she'd seen his uniform. Admiral Thompson let the silence stretch for a moment before responding. "Rank doesn't change character, Mom," he said evenly, "and it certainly shouldn't determine where someone sits on a plane." His words carried weight, resonating far beyond the confines of the aircraft. They weren't just directed at Karen. They were meant for everyone listening, a reminder that respect should never hinge on titles or appearances. As Karen slunk back to her seat, visibly shaken, the mood on the plane shifted once again. This time, it wasn't tension or discomfort that filled the air. It was admiration. Admiral Thompson may have been moved to economy class, but in the eyes of his fellow passengers, he had risen far above anything money could buy. The day started like any other for Admiral Marcus Thompson, a man whose life had been defined by discipline, honor, and service. As he walked through the bustling airport terminal, his presence commanded respect, not because of flashy clothes or loud behavior, but because of the quiet confidence that came from years of leadership. Though he wore a simple pair of slacks and a button-down shirt, there was something unmistakable about him. The way he carried himself, as if every step mattered. Admiral Thompson had just wrapped up a prestigious military conference where he delivered a keynote speech on leadership in challenging times. His words had resonated deeply with attendees, many of whom approached him afterward to express their admiration. But now, as he prepared to board his flight home, all he wanted was a moment of peace. The last thing on his mind was conflict. He arrived at the gate early, eager to avoid the usual rush before boarding. When his group was called, he made his way onto the plane with ease. First class wasn't something he indulged in often. He preferred humility over extravagance. But today felt different. After days of back-to-back meetings and long hours, he appreciated the small comfort of extra legroom and a quieter environment. It wasn't luxury, it was practicality. As he settled into his assigned seat near the window, Admiral Thompson glanced around the cabin. Families were saying goodbye at the jet bridge, children tugging at their parents' hands, while flight attendants moved efficiently down the aisles, checking safety equipment and offering warm smiles. Everything seemed normal, ordinary even. Little did he know, this flight would soon become anything but. His thoughts drifted as he leaned back in his seat. He thought about his career, the challenges, the triumphs, and the countless sacrifices along the way. Growing up, he'd faced obstacles that could have derailed his dreams, but instead, they fueled his determination. Now, decades later, he was one of the most respected figures in the U.S. Navy. Yet despite his accomplishments, moments like these reminded him how quickly assumptions could overshadow reality. People saw what they wanted to see, not always who someone truly was. The sound of rolling suitcases snapped him out of his reflections. Passengers began filling the seats around him, chatting animatedly about vacations, business trips, and weekend plans. A young couple across the aisle laughed softly as they flipped through photos on their phones, while an older man in a tailored suit thumbed through a newspaper, seemingly unfazed by the commotion. For a brief moment, Admiral Thompson allowed himself to relax. Maybe this flight would pass without incident, he thought. But then, everything changed. A woman appeared in the aisle, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. She paused beside Admiral Thompson's row, frowning as she compared her ticket to the seat numbers above. Her expression shifted from confusion to irritation within seconds. Without hesitation, she turned to him, her voice cutting through the hum of conversation. "Excuse me," she said sharply, "but I think you're in my seat." And just like that, the calm atmosphere evaporated. What followed would test Admiral Thompson's patience, principles, and resolve, and leave everyone aboard the flight questioning their own assumptions about identity, privilege, and respect. It wasn't long before curiosity got the better of one passenger. An elderly man seated a few rows ahead of Admiral Thompson, who had been quietly observing the earlier drama, finally mustered the courage to approach him. Leaning over the seat, he cleared his throat politely and said, "Excuse me, sir. I couldn't help but notice what happened earlier. Are you military, by any chance?" Admiral Thompson turned his head slightly, meeting the man's gaze with a calm expression. For a moment, he considered brushing off the question. It wasn't uncommon for strangers to make assumptions about his bearing, but something about the sincerity in the man's voice made him pause. "Yes," he replied simply, his tone measured but warm. "I'm with the Navy." The elderly man's eyes widened slightly, and he straightened up, clearly impressed. "Navy? Huh. That's incredible. My grandson is in the Army Reserve. He talks about how much discipline it takes. You must have quite a story." Admiral Thompson offered a faint smile, nodding. "It's been an interesting journey, that's for sure." Word spread quickly after that. The elderly man returned to his seat and shared the revelation with his wife, who promptly whispered it to the couple next to them. Within minutes, a ripple of murmurs traveled through the cabin. Passengers began stealing glances at Admiral Thompson, their earlier sympathy now tinged with awe. One young woman leaned forward to get a better look, her face lighting up as she realized who she was sharing the plane with. Then came the question no one expected. A middle-aged businessman seated across the aisle leaned over and asked hesitantly, "Sir, if you don't mind me asking, what rank are you?" Admiral Thompson hesitated, not because he was ashamed or secretive, but because he didn't want to draw unnecessary attention to himself. However, given the circumstances and the growing interest, he decided transparency might serve a greater purpose. Reaching into his bag, he pulled out his wallet and retrieved his official military ID badge. Without saying a word, he held it up just enough for those closest to see. The reaction was immediate. Gasps erupted from nearby passengers as they caught sight of the 3 stars gleaming on the card. Rear Admiral, upper half, United States Navy. Eyes widened, jaws dropped, and head swiveled toward Karen, who sat obliviously flipping through her magazine in first class. The contrast was staggering. Here was one of the highest-ranking black officers in the history of the U.S. Navy, a man whose career had inspired countless individuals, and she had dismissed him as someone unworthy of sitting in her section. One teenage boy, emboldened by the discovery, leaned over to whisper to his mom, "Mom, did you hear? He's like, super important." She nodded, her expression softening as she looked at Admiral Thompson with newfound respect. Another passenger, a young woman wearing a hoodie, reached for her phone and discreetly snapped a photo of the Admiral's ID badge, not out of malice, but because she wanted to remember this moment. Karen, however, remained blissfully unaware of the commotion behind her. It wasn't until a flight attendant approached her cautiously that reality began to sink in. "Ma'am," the attendant said gently, "there's something you should know. The gentleman you were arguing with earlier, he's a 3-star admiral in the Navy." For a split second, Karen froze, her magazine slipping from her hands. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, unable to form words. When she finally managed to speak, her voice trembled with panic. "What? No way. That can't be true." But the evidence was undeniable. By now, several passengers had confirmed the details among themselves, and some even joked quietly about how wrong Karen had been. One man quipped under his breath, "Guess he earned his seat more than anyone else here." His neighbor stifled a laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. As Admiral Thompson settled into his new seat in economy class, the atmosphere on the plane shifted. The earlier tension had morphed into something heavier, a mix of discomfort and disbelief that hung over the cabin like a storm cloud. Passengers who had witnessed the confrontation couldn't help but glance back at him occasionally, their expressions a blend of sympathy and bewilderment. How could this have happened? Why had the pilot sided with Karen instead of upholding fairness? Admiral Thompson, however, wasn't focused on the whispers or stares. He leaned back in his cramped seat, adjusting his posture to make the most of the limited space. Though outwardly calm, his mind was racing. The injustice of the situation gnawed at him, not because he cared about sitting in first class, but because of what it represented. This wasn't just about one flight. It was about years of being judged by appearances rather than actions. It was about the countless times people had underestimated him, questioned his abilities, or dismissed his achievements simply because of the color of his skin. He pulled out his phone, scrolling idly through emails as a distraction. But when a notification popped up reminding him of an upcoming speaking engagement titled "Overcoming Bias in Leadership," he couldn't help but chuckle bitterly. If only the people around him knew the irony of his current predicament. Here he was, a decorated admiral whose life's work revolved around breaking barriers and fostering inclusivity, yet he'd just been forced out of his rightful seat due to baseless assumptions. A few rows ahead, Karen returned to her first-class seat, seemingly satisfied with how things had turned out. She adjusted her scarf, smoothed her hair, and opened a glossy magazine, acting as though nothing unusual had occurred. To her, the matter was resolved, problem solved. But for those watching, her behavior only deepened the divide between right and wrong. The hypocrisy was glaring. She had accused Admiral Thompson of not belonging in first class, while failing to recognize her own lack of grace and decency. Meanwhile, the pilot retreated to the cockpit without another word, leaving the flight attendants to manage the lingering awkwardness. One of them approached Admiral Thompson hesitantly, offering a bottled water and a quiet apology. "I'm really sorry about all this," she said softly, her eyes filled with genuine regret. "It shouldn't have gone down like that." Admiral Thompson accepted the water with a small nod. "Thank you," he replied evenly. "I appreciate your kindness." His words were polite, but they carried an unspoken weight, one that acknowledged the complexity of the situation. The flight attendant lingered for a moment longer before moving on, visibly shaken by the ordeal. As the plane taxied down the runway, the hum of engines drowned out the murmurs of conversation. But even as passengers turned their attention to books, movies, or sleep, the memory of what had transpired lingered. A young mother seated nearby glanced at Admiral Thompson, then leaned over to whisper something to her teenage son. He nodded thoughtfully, glancing back at the man who had handled such blatant disrespect with remarkable poise. Further down the aisle, an older gentleman in a business suit tapped his wife's arm and gestured discreetly toward Admiral Thompson. "Something feels off about him," the man said quietly. "Not in a bad way. He's too composed, too dignified. Do you think he might be someone important?" His wife raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" The man shrugged. "I don't know. Just a hunch. People don't handle situations like that without a reason. Maybe we should ask." Though they didn't act on their curiosity immediately, the seed of intrigue had been planted. Other passengers began piecing together the same observations: the calm demeanor, the measured responses, the undeniable air of authority. Slowly but surely, whispers spread throughout the cabin. Who exactly was this man who had endured such treatment with such quiet strength? Back in his seat, Admiral Thompson remained oblivious to the growing speculation. He closed his eyes briefly, focusing on his breathing to steady himself. Despite the unfairness of the situation, he refused to let bitterness take root. Instead, he reminded himself of the bigger picture. Every challenge was an opportunity, a chance to rise above, to lead by example, and to inspire others to question their own biases. When the plane finally reached cruising altitude, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing the flight details and encouraging everyone to relax. Admiral Thompson opened his eyes, staring out the tiny window at the endless expanse of clouds below. Somewhere beyond the horizon lay home, where loved ones awaited his return. For now, though, he was stuck in a metal tube hurtling through the sky, surrounded by strangers who didn't. In the weeks that followed, Admiral Marcus Thompson became more than just a passenger on a controversial flight. He became a symbol of resilience and dignity. The incident had ignited conversations far beyond the confines of the plane, sparking discussions in workplaces, schools, and homes across the country. People were talking about bias, privilege, and the importance of treating everyone with respect, regardless of appearances. For Admiral Thompson, this was both humbling and empowering. He hadn't sought the spotlight, but now that it was upon him, he embraced it as an opportunity to drive meaningful change. Invitations poured in from all corners of society. Universities asked him to deliver commencement speeches. Corporations requested workshops on workplace inclusivity, and advocacy groups invited him to speak at rallies for racial equity. Each platform allowed him to share his story, not just the events of that fateful flight, but the lessons he'd learned throughout his life. At every event, he emphasized the same core message: respect is earned through character, not titles or uniforms. If we wait until someone reveals their rank or achievements to treat them fairly, we've already failed. His words resonated deeply, particularly because they came from a man who had lived those principles firsthand. Audiences listened intently as he recounted moments from his career, times when he had been underestimated or dismissed because of the color of his skin, yet persevered by focusing on excellence and integrity. His humility made him relatable, his wisdom made him unforgettable. By the end of each talk, standing ovations became the norm, and tearful attendees often lingered afterward to thank him personally. The airline, eager to rebuild trust after the scandal, reached out to Admiral Thompson with an unusual proposition. They wanted to collaborate with him to design a comprehensive diversity training program for their employees. Initially hesitant, Admiral Thompson agreed under one condition. The initiative had to go beyond lip service. It couldn't just be a series of PowerPoint slides. It needed to foster real understanding and accountability. Together, they developed interactive sessions where staff members confronted implicit biases, practiced empathy, and learned how to handle conflicts like the one aboard Flight 412 responsibly. When the program launched months later, Admiral Thompson attended its inaugural session, delivering a keynote address that left participants inspired and reflective. One employee approached him afterward, tears streaming down her face, and said, "Sir, I never realized how my actions, or inactions, could affect someone else so profoundly. Thank you for opening my eyes." Moments like these reaffirmed his belief in the power of education and dialogue. Meanwhile, Karen faded from public consciousness almost as quickly as she had entered it. Though her name remained synonymous with entitled behavior in memes and online forums, she avoided interviews and kept a low profile. Some speculated that the backlash had forced her to reevaluate her worldview, while others doubted any lasting change would occur. Either way, her role in the story served as a cautionary tale, a reminder that prejudice, no matter how subtle, could have far-reaching consequences. For Admiral Thompson, however, the true measure of success lay not in punishing individuals, but in transforming systems. As news outlets covered the airline's revamped policies, other companies began taking notice. Competitors adopted similar initiatives, and soon the ripple effect extended to industries beyond aviation. Schools incorporated Admiral Thompson's teachings into anti-bullying campaigns, and community organizations used his story to promote inclusivity. What had started as a single act of injustice blossomed into a nationwide movement toward greater awareness and equality. By year's end, Admiral Thompson received numerous accolades for his efforts, including honors from civil rights groups and humanitarian organizations. Yet none of these awards meant more to him than the letters he received from ordinary people, parents who thanked him for inspiring their children, colleagues who credited him with fostering safer work environments, and strangers who simply felt seen because of his courage to speak up. As he reflected on everything that had transpired, Admiral Thompson knew the fight against bias was far from over. There would always be challenges, setbacks, and uncomfortable conversations ahead. But he also knew that progress was possible. One voice, one action, one person at a time. And if a simple flight could teach millions to rethink their assumptions, then hope was alive and well. With renewed determination, Admiral Thompson returned to his duties, carrying with him the knowledge that leadership wasn't about titles or authority. It was about leaving the world better than you found it. The woman standing in the aisle, whom passengers would later come to know as Karen, wasted no time making her presence felt. Her tone was sharp, almost accusatory, as she repeated her claim. "This is my seat. You must have taken it by mistake." Admiral Thompson looked up calmly, meeting her gaze without flinching. He didn't need to check his ticket again. He had already confirmed his seat assignment when he boarded, but he did so anyway, just to be sure. With deliberate patience, he held up his boarding pass for her to see. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "this is seat 3A. My ticket matches the assignment." Karen barely glanced at the boarding pass before dismissing it with a wave of her hand. "That can't be right," she insisted, her voice rising slightly. "I paid for first class, and this is where I'm supposed to sit." A flicker of frustration crossed Admiral Thompson's face, but he kept his composure. He gestured toward the flight attendant, who was assisting other passengers nearby. "Let's ask them to double-check," he suggested, his voice steady and polite. Reluctantly, Karen flagged down the nearest flight attendant, a young woman with a warm smile and an apologetic demeanor. The attendant quickly scanned both tickets and confirmed what Admiral Thompson already knew. He was seated correctly. "Sir, you're in the right place," she assured him before turning to Karen. "Ma'am, your assigned seat is actually 3C, which is right next to this one." Instead of accepting the clarification, Karen grew more agitated. She planted her hands on her hips and stared at Admiral Thompson as though he were deliberately trying to inconvenience her. "Well, that doesn't make sense," she huffed. "There's no way someone like you should be sitting here." The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. Passengers nearby exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether they'd heard correctly. Someone like him. What exactly did she mean? Admiral Thompson raised an eyebrow, but chose not to engage further. Experience had taught him that arguing rarely solved anything, especially when emotions ran high. Instead, he leaned back slightly, folding his arms across his chest. "Ma'am," he replied coolly, "I think the flight attendant has made things clear. If there's still confusion, perhaps we can involve the gate agent." But Karen wasn't interested in solutions. She seemed determined to escalate the situation. Her cheeks flushed red as she shot back. "You don't belong here. Look at you. Do you even fly first class often? This section is for people who earn it." The insult was thinly veiled, dripping with condescension. Though she didn't outright say it, her meaning was crystal clear. She believed Admiral Thompson didn't fit the image of a first-class passenger based on how he looked. By now, the tension in the cabin was palpable. Passengers who had initially ignored the commotion began paying closer attention, whispering among themselves. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others openly stared, curious about how the confrontation would unfold. One older gentleman seated nearby shook his head disapprovingly, muttering under his breath, "What a mess." Karen's behavior only grew more aggressive. Ignoring the flight attendant's attempts to mediate, she leaned closer to Admiral Thompson, pointing at him emphatically. "You're ruining my trip," she declared, as if his mere presence constituted some kind of personal affront. "If you had any decency, you'd move to economy class where you obviously belong." Admiral Thompson blinked slowly, absorbing her words without reacting immediately. Inside, he felt a mix of anger and disappointment, not because of Karen's rudeness, but because he recognized the deeper issue at play. This wasn't the first time someone had questioned his right to occupy a space simply because of preconceived notions about his appearance. It was a familiar struggle, one he'd faced throughout his career, and it never failed to remind him of the biases embedded in society. Still, he refused to let her provoke him. Taking a deep breath, he addressed Karen directly, his tone measured but firm. "Ma'am, I've done nothing wrong. I'm seated in the correct spot, and I intend to stay here. If you have concerns about your own seat, I suggest speaking with the airline staff. They're here to help." For a moment, it seemed like Karen might relent, but then her expression hardened, and she muttered something under her breath that sounded suspiciously like figures. Without another word, she stormed off toward the front of the plane, presumably to find someone else to vent to. The cabin fell silent once again, though the unease lingered. Admiral Thompson exhaled softly, shaking his head almost imperceptibly. He knew this wouldn't be the end of it. The revelation about Admiral Thompson's rank spread like wildfire, and soon the entire plane was buzzing with a mix of shock, admiration, and disbelief. Passengers who had previously kept their distance were now eager to express their support, or at least their awe. A young mother seated near Admiral Thompson leaned over and whispered, "Thank you for your service, sir. Truly." Her words carried sincerity, and her young son gave him a shy thumbs up from behind her arm. Admiral Thompson nodded graciously, offering a small smile that somehow managed to convey both humility and strength. Meanwhile, Karen sat rigidly in her first-class seat, her earlier bravado completely shattered. She stared straight ahead, avoiding eye contact with anyone, but it was clear she was wrestling with a storm of emotions: shame, embarrassment, and perhaps even fear. What had started as a petty argument over seating had spiraled into something much larger, exposing biases she may not have even realized she harbored. For the first time in her life, she found herself on the receiving end of collective judgment, and it wasn't a comfortable place to be. But the reckoning didn't stop there. As news of Admiral Thompson's identity reached the cockpit, the pilot emerged once again, this time looking visibly uneasy. He approached the Admiral with hesitant steps, his usual air of authority replaced by an awkward stiffness. Clearing his throat, he extended a hand toward Admiral Thompson. "Sir," he began, his voice tinged with regret, "I owe you an apology. I handled the situation poorly earlier, and I'm truly sorry." Admiral Thompson looked up, meeting the pilot's gaze with unwavering composure. He didn't immediately accept the handshake. Instead, he studied the man for a moment, as if weighing his sincerity. Finally, he spoke, his tone calm but firm. "Apologies are important, but actions matter more. Do you understand why what happened here today is problematic?" The pilot nodded vigorously, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. "Yes, sir. Absolutely. I let bias cloud my judgment, and that's not acceptable. I promise it won't happen again." Admiral Thompson raised an eyebrow slightly, unimpressed by the rehearsed response. "It's easy to say these things in the moment," he replied, "but real change requires reflection. Ask yourself, would you have treated me differently if I'd been wearing my uniform? Would Karen have acted the way she did if she'd seen my rank right away?" The questions hung heavy in the air, forcing the pilot, and everyone else within earshot, to confront uncomfortable truths. The pilot opened his mouth to respond, but found himself at a loss for words. After a long pause, he simply nodded again, his expression one of genuine remorse. "You're absolutely right, sir. I'll do better moving forward." Though Admiral Thompson accepted the apology eventually, shaking the pilot's hand with a measured grip, it was clear that forgiveness didn't come easily. This wasn't just about one incident. It was about addressing systemic issues that persisted in society. Bias wasn't always overt. It often lurked beneath the surface, manifesting in subtle ways that could still cause harm. And Admiral Thompson knew firsthand how exhausting it could be to constantly prove oneself against such prejudices. As the pilot retreated to the cockpit, murmurs of approval rippled through the cabin. Passengers exchanged nods and smiles, silently acknowledging the importance of accountability. One woman in economy class leaned over to her husband and said softly, "That man is a true leader. Not because of his rank, but because of how he carries himself." Her husband agreed, adding, "He turned this whole mess into a lesson without even trying." Karen, meanwhile, remained silent, shrinking further into her seat as though hoping to disappear entirely. When the flight attendant offered her a beverage, she declined with a mumbled "No, thank you," unable to meet the attendant's eyes. It was clear she understood the weight of her actions and the public scrutiny they had invited. By the time the plane began its descent, the atmosphere on board had transformed entirely. What had started as a tense and divisive journey had evolved into something unexpected. A shared experience that forced everyone to reflect on their own beliefs and behaviors. Some passengers clapped softly as Admiral Thompson gathered his belongings to disembark, while others simply offered warm smiles or respectful nods. Even the teenagers in the back row, who had initially rolled their eyes at the drama, seemed to leave the flight with a newfound appreciation for standing up against injustice. As Admiral Thompson stepped off the plane, he felt a mixture of emotions: relief, pride, and a lingering sadness for the work that still needed to be done. But he also carried as Admiral Thompson stepped into the arrivals terminal, he could feel the weight of the day's events pressing down on him. Physically, he was home, but mentally, he knew the story wasn't over. The confrontation on the plane had been more than just a personal affront. It was a reflection of larger societal issues that couldn't be ignored. With a deep breath, he resolved to address it head-on. He pulled out his phone and began documenting what had happened, attaching timestamps and details while memories were still fresh. Within hours, word spread beyond the confines of the aircraft. Passengers who had witnessed the incident took to social media, sharing their accounts of the altercation. Photos of Admiral Thompson's ID badge, captured discreetly during the flight, circulated online alongside captions praising his composure and condemning Karen's behavior. Hashtags like #RespectAdmiralThompson and #BiasInAirTravel trended quickly, sparking debates about discrimination in public spaces. People from all walks of life chimed in, recounting their own experiences of being judged based on appearance rather than merit. The backlash against Karen and the airline was swift and unrelenting. Screenshots of her earlier comments, "You don't belong here, and first class is for people who earn it," were plastered across Twitter and Instagram, accompanied by scathing critiques of her attitude. Memes mocking her entitled behavior flooded timelines, turning her into an unwitting symbol of privilege gone unchecked. Meanwhile, calls for accountability directed at the airline grew louder. Customers demanded answers. How could a pilot side with someone making baseless accusations instead of upholding fairness? Why hadn't staff intervened sooner to protect a paying passenger? By mid-afternoon, the airline released a carefully worded statement apologizing for the unfortunate incident. They acknowledged that Admiral Thompson had been treated unfairly and assured the public that they were investigating the matter thoroughly. However, the apology rang hollow to many observers, especially after leaked reports revealed that the pilot had a history of similar complaints filed against him. Passengers claimed he had previously shown favoritism toward certain travelers, while dismissing others' concerns, a pattern that suggested systemic bias within the company. Public outrage only intensified when video footage surfaced. A passenger had discreetly recorded part of the argument between Karen and Admiral Thompson, capturing her dismissive tone and accusatory remarks. The clip went viral almost instantly, garnering millions of views. Viewers expressed disbelief not only at Karen's audacity, but also at the pilot's complicity. One commenter summed it up succinctly: "If this can happen to a decorated admiral, what hope do the rest of us have?" Under mounting pressure, the airline acted decisively. By evening, they announced that the pilot involved had been suspended pending further investigation, and ultimately terminated days later due to his poor track record. As for Karen, she became persona non grata in travel circles. Her name and face, thanks to blurry photos shared online, was added to the airline's no-fly list, effectively banning her from future flights. While some argued these measures were harsh, others felt they were long overdue. After all, actions had consequences, and hers had crossed a line. Amid the chaos, Admiral Thompson remained remarkably composed. Though inundated with interview requests and messages of support, he chose to focus on the bigger picture. In a brief statement posted to his verified social media account, he thanked those who stood by him, but emphasized that the issue extended far beyond one flight or one individual. "This isn't about me," he wrote. "It's about challenging the biases that exist in our daily lives. Respect shouldn't depend on rank, wealth, or outward appearances. It should be universal." His words resonated deeply, striking a chord with countless people worldwide. Advocacy groups seized the opportunity to highlight broader issues of racial profiling and inequity in industries like aviation. Journalists reached out to Admiral Thompson for interviews, eager to hear his perspective on leadership, resilience, and overcoming prejudice. Instead of shying away, he leaned in, using his platform to advocate for change. During one televised interview, he recounted the events calmly, framing them as a teachable moment rather than a personal grievance. When asked how he maintained such grace under pressure, he smiled faintly. "Years of practice," he said simply. "Discrimination isn't new to me, or to many others. But every time we confront it, we chip away at the system that allows it to persist." By the end of the week, the story had sparked real-world action. The airline announced plans to implement mandatory diversity training programs for employees. Inspired in part, Karen's dramatic exit didn't last long. Within minutes, she returned, this time with reinforcements, or so she thought. Trailing behind her was the pilot, a middle-aged man with graying temples and an air of authority that immediately drew attention. Passengers craned their necks to see what was happening, curiosity piqued by the unfolding drama. The flight attendant, who had been trying valiantly to keep the peace, stepped aside as Karen gestured emphatically toward Admiral Thompson, clearly intent on enlisting the pilot's support. "This is unacceptable," Karen announced loudly, her voice carrying through the cabin. "I paid good money for my seat, and this man refuses to move. He doesn't even look like he belongs here." Her words were laced with indignation, but also something else, something more insidious. It wasn't just about the seat anymore. It was about asserting dominance, about proving a point. And unfortunately for Admiral Thompson, the pilot seemed all too willing to listen. The pilot crossed his arms and surveyed the scene, his expression unreadable at first. Then, after a brief pause, he turned to Admiral Thompson. "Sir," he began, his tone clipped and devoid of warmth, "is there any chance you'd consider moving to another seat? It might resolve things quickly and save everyone some trouble." Admiral Thompson blinked, momentarily taken aback by the request. Trouble? What exactly was the trouble here? He hadn't caused a scene or disrupted anyone's travel plans. In fact, he'd done everything in his power to de-escalate the situation. Yet now, instead of holding Karen accountable for her behavior, the pilot was asking him, the person seated correctly, to compromise. "I'm sorry," Admiral Thompson replied, his voice calm but firm, "but I'm in the seat I paid for. If there's an issue with the seating arrangement, it should be resolved without inconveniencing passengers who are already where they're supposed to be." His response was reasonable, logical even, but the pilot didn't seem interested in reason. Instead, he glanced at Karen, whose smug smile suggested she felt vindicated. "Look," the pilot said, his tone shifting to one of thinly veiled impatience, "it would make things easier if you could just switch seats. We don't want to delay the flight over something like this." Easier? For whom? Admiral Thompson couldn't help but wonder. Certainly not for him. Moving to economy class wouldn't only mean sacrificing comfort. It would feel like surrendering to baseless accusations fueled by prejudice. By now, the entire cabin was watching intently. Some passengers looked sympathetic, shaking their heads in disapproval of how the situation was being handled. Others appeared uncomfortable, unsure whether to side with Karen or defend the quiet man in the first-class seat. A few whispered among themselves, speculating about what might happen next. One teenager in the row behind muttered loud enough for those nearby to hear, "This is ridiculous." Karen seized the moment to drive her point home. "See," she exclaimed, pointing at Admiral triumphantly. "Even the pilot agrees with me. You're causing a scene, and frankly, it's embarrassing." Embarrassing? For whom? Admiral Thompson wanted to ask. Was it embarrassing for him to assert his rights, or was it embarrassing for her to reveal her true colors? Despite the mounting pressure, Admiral Thompson remained composed. He knew better than to let frustration get the best of him. After a long pause, he addressed the pilot directly. "With all due respect," he said, his voice steady and measured, "I don't believe I'm the one causing the problem here. I've followed the rules, shown my ticket, and cooperated fully. Asking me to move isn't fair, and it sends the wrong message." For a split second, it seemed like the pilot might reconsider. But then Karen interjected again, her voice shrill and unrelenting. "Enough of this nonsense. If he won't move, maybe you should remove him from the flight altogether." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Remove him? For sitting in the correct seat. The absurdity of the demand was almost laughable, yet no one dared to laugh. This was real life, not a comedy sketch. Faced with Karen's ultimatum and the pilot's apparent reluctance to challenge her, Admiral Thompson made a decision. Rising slowly from his seat, he grabbed his carry-on bag and slung it over his shoulder. "Fine," he said quietly, his tone betraying neither anger nor defeat. "I'll move." As he walked down the aisle toward economy class, the weight of the injustice settled heavily on his shoulders. Passengers watched in stunned silence as he took his new seat near the back of the plane. Though he tried to appear unaffected, the sting of discrimination lingered, a reminder that no matter how far he'd come in life, some battles still felt painfully familiar.